This is the third interview I've had with Matt Ehret of the Canadian Patriot. He knows so much stuff that we all need to know, the history that we're not told. And I have to share with you why we're speaking today. I've gone my entire life not knowing about, I believe, the greatest American patriot who saved America and I believe saved the West. Major General Smedley Butler. This man, I wasn't taught about him. None of us are taught about him. Why? Because what he did was so significant. God forbid for those people who have nefarious plans for the rest of us, someone like that was to really rise up, everything would be put right.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government. I talked with an investigator for this committee who came to me with a subpoena on Sunday, November 18th. He told me they had unearthed evidence linking my name with several such veteran organizations. As it then seemed to me to be getting serious, I felt it was my duty to tell all I knew of such activities to this committee. My main interest in all this is to preserve our democratic institutions. I want to retain the right to vote, the right to speak freely, and the right to write. If we maintain these basic principles, our democracy is safe. No dictatorship can exist with suffrage, freedom of speech, and press.
In my last book, I called it The King of Main Street. I didn't call it the King of Wall Street or for our Canadian friends, Bay Street. I called it Main Street. And the reason I called it is because I read a story about Cincinnatus and how Washington admired this man who is part of the Roman Republic. He was retired on a 4-acre plot of land and he was plowing with a mule. And the Republic was about to fall and the senators could not agree. So they went to him and they asked him to become the dictator. Yes, it had different connotations at that point. And he put down the plow and he took up the sword and he put down the rebellion, the hordes that were going to destroy Rome. And they offered for him to be the dictator. And he said, no, I did it for the Republic. He put down the sword and he took up the plow. So I called my book The King of Main Street because many of us who've had good lives are now being called upon to put down our plow and to take up the sword and to protect Western civilization.
Well, no, and that was a really wonderful introduction. And for me, just as a quick side note before getting into the books, I could say that Cincinnatus as well has been a remarkable human individual and role model for myself as well, and for many great figures that I've come to admire and respect immensely throughout history, and especially when you look at the original founding fathers of the United States. It was the Society of Cincinnatus that was created by Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, Marquis de Lafayette, in order to create an institution that would ideally, it was designed, I don't know if it necessarily always served that purpose, but it was designed to this effect, to be an institution to pass down the ideas and traditions and way of thinking about morality, the ethical role of the citizen and the leader that the United States needed to cultivate every generation to maintain the aspirations to attain what Plato basically called for in his Republic around a philosopher king. And he made a point that a society, you know, and the study of much of Plato's works, and especially the Republic, is a study on what happens to a state when it does not have a culture that cultivates both people as well as leaders who love truth more than their material possessions or other lower interests, real wisdom. And so in the Plato's Republic, you have the developer, basically the showcasing of societies that slide between anarchic mob rule to a timocracy, the rule by the warrior class, to oligarchy and tyranny, and back and forth. So there's this cycle, this repetitive, tragic cycle that humanity is condemned to live again and again, unless it can be broken by the advent of a true philosopher king. But that can't just be one person, because one person dies. So you have to have a culture that ensures that more and more people can tap into those characteristics that they have of the divine within them, and the love, pursuit, and sharing of those experiences. And that's the whole challenge, not only of the Republic, which was, I think it was published in 354 BC, but of people like Cicero, who again took up his own republic and his own study in the form of his Commonwealth. And I think it was 64 BC before he's killed. He has his own Socrates moment, and his enemies, who are corrupting the Republic of Rome and trying to turn it into an empire, end up getting the best of the people and pervert and corrupt them, just as the people of Athens had been corrupted by the Sophists, who themselves were deployed by and arranged as weapons to pollute the minds and morals of the people by things like the cult of Delphi, the cult of Apollo at Delphi, and other agencies
the
that
sacred
would
prostitutes, like for middle-aged men, it was the sacred prostitutes. They would go there for like a year, and they would go through their psychological change,
erotic experience. Yeah, it was all.
Well, it was really birth death, because I think a problem that a lot of men have when they get to their 40s, they start having one foot in both camps, death, because now it becomes real for them. And also they feel young enough, so they want to hold them. It's sort of like they had that energy. Very dangerous. A lot of guys will throw off their wives or buy an expensive car at that point, because they're trying to, we've seen it. It's called the midlife crisis.
When you have, people's bodies grow, but their minds and hearts remain infantile, you get these beings who are at war with themselves, right?
And when I think about that, I think that we have uninitiated men. Women go through initiation, but we do not initiate our men, because they need to be hit on the head to become responsible for the tribe. I'll just give you an example. What it is like you're supposed to leave the women's camp. You now go into the men's camp. Your father brings you there, but he's not the one who initiates you, because he has to be, he has the role of father, and you have to become a man of equals, but you have to go through some type of trial. And then at that point, you become tied to the community. And I always found it interesting, because these primitive societies that we look at being primitive, they didn't have as much as we have right now. So there must have been some type of utility to initiate young men to feel responsible for the community. Right now, we don't. And that's one of the big issues right now. But before we go into your books, there's two things I also think of when you say Plato. I also think of some of the mythology. I think of Sisyphus. He pushes a stone, and it keeps on rolling back every morning. That's a human life. That really is. Someone used a modern day example. They said 50 dates. Remember that movie with Drew Barrymore and Sandler? That every day she woke up, she forgot what happened. So it's like 50 dates. That's human life. Because you and I, by the time we might get to a certain epiphany of knowledge of how this place works, well, it's time for us to go. And I also think of, when people refer to the elite, I think of Icarus. I think that these elites, when I read about them, back like when they were talking about eugenics, they were like, at parties talking about what to do with like the rank and file, like they were nothing. And I just think about that, and that's what led me to Smedley Butler, because he was someone who said, no, life has value, these people have value, and they should actually be the ones to make the major decisions. But before we get into that, let's talk about the books that you've written, like just the basic themes that came about and the names of them and why you wrote them. What motivated you to spend time reflecting and searching out information to write? These are really great books.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the first book series that I had written between 2012 and 2018 was a series of 4 books. Well, I wrote 3 of the 4, called the Untold History of Canada. The Untold History of Canada set the stage in my mind because it was part of a partially therapeutic, partially just a political process that I was a part of, where I needed to figure out what was the terrain that I was operating in as a political organizer in Canada. I was involved at the time with an organization, I think we've talked about this in our previous chats, affiliated with the late economist Lyndon LaRouche. And there were certain tasks that I had set myself towards as a volunteer that involved doing certain things, setting up meetings in Ottawa with various members of parliament, their staffs, a lot of embassy officials actually came to various political briefings and updates that I had a certain role to play in organizing. And also part of it involved organizing the people with political tables, things like that, average citizens who didn't really know how to think about conspiracies or the banking collapse or matters of war and peace. But, we had to figure out a way to both study this ourselves, to go from like almost, I was a bit of a blank slate in some ways. I didn't really have much of an intellectual identity, except that I knew we were being manipulated by oligarchs. That I discovered on my own, but I didn't know what to do, So I began my activism that way, but there was a disconnect, especially when talking to Canadians about what is it that they can do, what pathways are available for Canadians regarding, activating the Bank of Canada, fighting for certain policies that could change the trajectory from where we were going to something better.
Right.
And unfortunately, it was an American organization, and I was using purely research and policy measures that were for an American audience, but we were in Canada, so there was a difficulty, a disconnect. So the emergence of the book series, The Untold History of Canada, came about after years and years with a couple of colleagues of mine who felt the same way, that we needed to figure out, well, what is the history of Canada? What is shaping the Privy Council? What are the other decision-making mechanisms that we have to interface with, so we could bring on Canadians into an awareness of something much bigger than what they're told reality is on TV. So that was a pretty good and series of paradigm shifters.
What shifting did after you finished those books? What big lesson did you take from our country? The theme.
Well, the theme is that we've never been an independent country as we have been told, but rather have always been, past and present, a geopolitical chess piece on a great game run by British social engineers and grand strategists that had very little to do with the interests of Canadian people. However, in the same measure, when you start seeing the lies and the ugly darkness of a lot of this manipulation, you start appreciating some of the Canadian heroes who arose at different times in the 19th century, throughout the 20th century, in some cases even gave their lives for the sake of an independent, sovereign Canada that would be beholden to the will of the people and the greater good, whose names I didn't really quite appreciate beyond the name alone. I didn't know about them. They'd been almost scrubbed out of history, despite many of these people having been prime ministers, premiers of various provinces, and others. Like Daniel Johnson Sr., the Premier of Quebec, who likely was assassinated in 1968 at the unveiling of a major dam, the Manicouagan 5. W.A.C. Bennett, another great figure from British Columbia, for 20 years, the Premier, who fought very hard against these Malthusian Rhodes Scholars, usually is what they were, who were trying to sabotage his grand designs and development of the Arctic. Diefenbaker was another figure as a prime minister who was a little more soft-minded, but a really strong heart, and had a very strong idea of, again, a Canada that would be based upon scientific, technological progress, the overcoming of the limits to growth, opening up of the Arctic. And unfortunately, his ideas were sabotaged by, again, Rhodes Scholars working through the Bank of Canada at the time, people
Matt, when you talk about Rhodes Scholars, can you just give us a little example of what you mean by that? Because when I thought of Rhodes Scholars in the past, I thought, oh, Bill Clinton, he's a Rhodes Scholar. He's brilliant, right?
Yeah.
that was his dossier to become president. Like, oh, he's a Rhodes Scholar. Oh, isn't Freeland a Rhodes Scholar?
Yeah. Yeah. And so was Bob Ray, who was the interim leader of the Liberal Party before Justin. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He worked closely as an NDP premier of Ontario for a period of the 90s with Maurice Strong to handicap and undermine Ontario's next generation energy policy with Ontario Hydro, and specifically just Maurice Strong's assignment heading Ontario Hydro in 94, 95 was to destroy nuclear power, which, I mean, Ontario's 50% nuclear power, just destroy the entire industry, run it into the ground, that was his assignment. He did pretty well, though it was rehabilitated after he left. But Bob Ray was the guy who put him in. Bob Ray was a Rhodes Scholar, like I said, at the time, NDP, but he flipped, just like Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was not a Rhodes Scholar, but also was NDP and flipped. NDP was, the Fabian Society of Canada when it was set up in 1931 as the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation by 5 Rhodes Scholars. S. Scott Reed being one of them, and F.R. Scott being one of the key handlers of Pierre Elliott Trudeau being the other one. S. Scott Reed, for those who don't know, was the one of the key figures who founded. He's like the grand strategist who founded the architecture of what became NATO in 1949. But S. Scott Reed set it all up in 1947. So you have this whole nest. And these things were organized always from London. They were not American. They were not Canadian. And the Rhodes Scholarship Program was set up by the funds of Cecil Rhodes, as well as some Rothschild money at the end of the 19th century. 1902 was when it really kicked off. It was overseen by a Canadian named George Parkin, who was the head of Upper Canada College. George Parkin was the head of the Rhodes Trust funds that paid for the growth of think tanks called roundtable movements first, and then it became they changed their name, but into something else in 1919 called the Chatham House, or Royal Institutes for International Affairs, first in Britain, and then with a sister operation set up in America called the Council on Foreign Relations. In Canada, it was set up in the form of the Canadian Institute for International Affairs, which was run by its first secretary, S. Scott Reed, right before, as he's setting up the Fabian Society of Canada. And again, it wasn't called the NDP yet; it was called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, and then it changed its name to the NDP in 1960 under Tommy Douglas. The thing in Australia, it had its own branch, which Gough Whitlam, who was the Prime Minister of Australia, did battle with in 1972 when he exposed that whole operation. And he was ousted by the Queen's Governor General, what was his name? John Kerr, who ousted him, basically fired him unceremoniously, undemocratically, just because he was trying to stand up for an independent Australia. And there was branches in South Africa as well, under the apartheid South Africa of Kruger in 1935 that was created in New Zealand too. So that's at the heart of the Five Eyes. That's basically it. Yeah. And it interfaces with the Rhodes Scholars, who are at this point about 7,000 young people have been over the last century given these scholarships. What a great thing, right? To go and get processed and indoctrinated in the halls of Oxford, and thence redeployed back into the positions, whatever, it could be private, public sector, media, corporate, entrepreneur, whatever. A lot of it is based upon foreign policy. That's a high, like people like Susan Rice, for example, who's a leading foreign policy controller of both the previous Bill Clinton, but also Obama and now Biden administrations. You got people like
Cory Booker.
Cory Booker is another one. Jake Sullivan is another one, who is a handler of demented Biden. He was Strobe Talbot, was the head of Brookings Institute, which both Susan Rice and Jake Sullivan worked for throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s. And Strobe Talbot was a Rhodes Scholar who actually was a roommate with Bill Clinton in Oxford. Bill Clinton really unleashed the floodgates. They were always there. Like a lot of these Rhodes Scholars shaped much of the Cold War strategy, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. Forgetting some of their names at the moment, but the key figures also within Rand Corps. So they just permeated, and they used.
So there's a lot of bad players that have been bought off, and they've been placed in. Because I just want to share something that I found really disturbing because I just watched it. In 2004, you've got a Democratic presidential candidate, and you have George Bush. You've got Kerry and you got Bush, and both of them went to Princeton. Both went to Princeton, and both are members of Skull and Bones. And they make a pledge. They make a pledge that they'll do whatever it takes to support another Skull and Bones member. So we're talking, this is all theater for you and I, who happen to be little amoebas, and the reason why I say that is they were both running for president, but they swore a pledge that they would die and do whatever they could for a fellow member. They get 15 members every year, and it's like the Uniparty. And you're a good friend, Mel K. That's what she calls it. And those interviews that I saw, I think it was on NBC, individually, that was the perfect sign to me that what she was saying is true. These two men are pretending to have different ideas, but they answer to the same master.
Yeah, well, it's the way the old techniques have always worked. It's not a new, it's taken on maybe a new veneer in our modern age, but it's the same old techniques of rites of initiation into higher degrees of something that the initiates believe they're being indoctrinated into, something that brings them into a higher position of authority in a process of great importance. The reality is they're just losing their soul with every passing step, where they themselves are being processed, slowly deconditioned, depatterned in through certain techniques, certain forms of hypnosis, neuro-linguistic programming. Other things are being set up to create experiences to give them a sense of having a mission beyond themselves. But in reality, they're becoming more and more just instrumentalized on behalf of a higher power broker who can deploy them and use them on a grand chessboard. So, I mean, you look at most of these figures, and part of me feels like disgust and part just pity, because it's like, could Chrystia Freeland have been a really great, wonderful person if given a different set of opportunities and experiences outside of Oxford?
And a different grandfather?
Well, you don't want to blame somebody for the grandpa. Her family traditions didn't help her young uncritical self from taking a more healthy path. That's for sure.
There was, just to share with you, I was reading some documents, maybe you've seen it, that the KGB were saying, she was doing terrible things in Ukraine when she was in her 20s. It came out.
They had a dossier. Yeah, she definitely made a splash when she was up there as an aspiring young, Sorosite reformer embedded within a variety of things and connected to a variety of things that people only got a taste of later on when she started working for Reuters, which was really just the cover for, international espionage, narrative framing, keeping certain mythologies. And that's what most, Thomson, Reuters, it's generally, how do you hypnotize the masses and keep certain stories and filters in the minds of the people who will be reading Associated Press, CanWest. Reuters is a big one, and she was positioned in Russia to manage, how the Western people interpret what is going on in Russia. That was her assignment. So yeah, of course, she always had a very dishonest orientation, would always frame reality in a very dishonest way. And the Russians always knew that. And the fact that her career went on for quite a long ways in that vein before it was put onto her new assignment in politics in 2013 as kind of a handler of sorts to young
Yes.
bubblehead Justin, who he just
Yes.
looks up. She's kind of like the Valerie Jarrett to Justin's Obama, you know, in that sense.
Yes.
Um,
One thing I want to share with our audience, because I want to
mm,
focus on your books that focus on the United States, like how you
mm,
transition. But first, I want to share something about Christian Friedland, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, who has a few more IQ points than the current Prime Minister. She was first made, well, she was a foreign minister, and she negotiated such a great deal for Canada with Trump not. Number two, she was then appointed to be the finance minister. And if you look at her history, every business that she ran went bankrupt. How do you put this person in charge of the finances? You know that there's going to be a $700 billion deficit with someone who's never had any success with their own bank book.
People think, oh, what are they doing? They're so incompetent that they're running the banking system and the economy into the ground. And it's like, well, kind of, yeah, there is a certain quality of incompetence, but at the same time, that's the job. That's the assignment. Their
Yeah.
job is not to make money or to make a successful economy. Their job has been the New World Order script that's been operational now for the entirety of the last century. But it really, the form that it's currently taking right now is really put into motion in a hard way over the dead bodies of many great anti-Malthusian statesmen of the 1960s, like Bobby Kennedy. Again, I mentioned Daniel Johnson Sr., Pierre Laporte, the deputy premier of Quebec, who was killed in 1970 under an operation overseen by Pierre Trudeau, the October crisis. And then, you know, what you had with Nixon was basically a takeover. It was a coup. It was a coup, but not just in America, but as far as an international financial coup that transformed the fundamental rules of the idea of what finance, banking, economics, and politics were and how they related to each other. It was all changed. And people don't realize the fundamental, deep-rooted nature of that change, which
Are you referring to getting off the gold standard?
that was a precondition of it, but the 1971 breaking of the gold standard onto the floating exchange rates was a necessary mechanical change that had to happen for the new ethical paradigm of monetarism to become normalized, which formerly was not the dominant philosophy of what is value. It was all about the fight over value, right? What value is everything. It's like, what do you value? Is
Well,
going to be
it was a petrodollar, and the deal that they cut with the Saudis and the Wahhabis.
Yeah, no,
The
that was
petro,
exactly. Well, that's what then tied the value of dollars, of the US dollar, which everybody had still because of the original Bretton Woods agreement. Everybody had reserves of dollars to settle their balance of payments. And that was the way it had worked. Not necessarily a bad thing if you have an actual ethic premised on real capital creation and real entrepreneurialism, it's fine. But it doesn't work if you don't have that. And so what they did is then they said, okay, the new way we're going to value the new valuation of the US dollar is going to be the spot markets and futures markets that are going to be tied to the price of oil. And that became the petrodollar. And that was done through another sort of sleight of hand arranged by Henry Kissinger at the time, who was Secretary of State, who organized, with the help of certain agencies within Saudi Arabia, a false scarcity. And that was the oil shocks of the early 70s, and which saw oil prices increase by 400%. And, you know, there were lineups that, you know, a lot of people your age still remember sitting in line for hours and hours to get their.
not that old. I was a little kid when that happened. But thank you.
You're a man of wisdom, so I presumed that you had a.
I'm old enough to remember when they moved from the gallon under Joe Clark. I was just sitting. This is when they used to fill up your cars.
Yeah.
Joe Clark had switched it over from the gallon to the liter, and then he raised it with taxes, but it was a sleight of hand because now, like, a liter was less than a gallon.
Yeah. Well, that was it. That was a theft. And I guess so. Yeah, you were a kid in the back seat of your parents' car probably when they were waiting in line.
No safety belts either.
No, I remember my dad had a car too in the 80s that, yeah, no safety belts in the back. I remember bouncing around, walking around on the seat. You know, it was just something that you did.
The books that focused on the U.S., because we're going to move over to Smedley Butler, because his story to me is such an example. So let's move into your books in the States, because
Okay. So the books in the States are called the Clash of the Two Americas. There's been so far 3 volumes written. There's going to be a 4th out in January. The first volume went through the first century, beginning with the international dynamics of 1776, with a chapter also on why Canada missed out on the opportunity to be a part of that process, and we failed the Ben Franklin Challenge. But it really opens with an idea that America is more than you thought it was, and less than it was meant to be. Going through all of the international networks, stretching as far as into the Emperor of Morocco, the Hyder Ali, the head of the Mysore Rebellion of India, who all were consciously part of the Ben Franklin conspiracy, as well as many people from Russia, Catherine the Great, leadership of France, Germany, even Prussia. So it was an international network that all had been organized to understand that human beings could bring into being a new age of sovereign nation-state republics that would be cooperative and work together for the idea that that oligarchism and the hereditary class as an institution would not be viable into the future. We would overcome that and mature as a species. So that's really and there's a lot of quotes from players who participated in that process. That's been scrubbed completely. Canadians, Americans even don't get that part of the history. They get a very simplified, dumbed down, narrow-minded, idiotic version of that story that only features like the US didn't want to pay taxes and didn't like British tea or something, very lame. And so anyway, I reconstruct as much as I can the growth of the deep state in America today that people know of as not a new phenomenon, but I really wanted to situate as a continuous process how this deep state thing is actually not American. It is the stay-behinds that acted like American patriots on the surface, but were always loyal to the British oligarchical and European oligarchical system of controls involving especially also Switzerland, Geneva. And that's part of the whole Venetian complex that emerged out of the Roman Empire back in the 800s. So it's a continuous process. And so I sort of paint that picture throughout the first volume, ending in around 1901 with the murder of McKinley. Volume 2 picks up at the murder of McKinley and what was the policy orientation that McKinley was fighting to bring the United States back into harmony with, as far as
I think I know that he was killed in Buffalo.
Buffalo at the time was an anarchist hub. People don't realize it, but that the domestic terrorists of that day that were controlled by intelligence agencies were these anarchists, often of an Engels Marxian bent, but not really exactly. A lot of them were controlled by the British Foreign Office. A lot of them had alliances with Prince Kropotkin, who was a high-level Russian noble. Actually, he saw himself as the heir to the Rurik dynasty of 1,000 years earlier, and wanted to basically reclaim his position as the dominant figure of Russia. And by ousting the Romanovs, but yet he's known as being this great like anarcho syndicalist, along with Mikhail Bakunin and others. So they had a whole weird network inside of the United States. A lot of that basing was protected from Canada. People like Emma Goldman also was a big part of that. Yeah. In fact, it was Emma Goldman's disciple who was deployed to carry out the hit against McKinley. Goldman was arrested, and actually her bail was paid for by none other than Lord Bertrand Russell in 1902. And both of them were parts of what was members of what's called the British Neo-Malthusian League, this basic club for the elites who believe that human beings should be depopulated and kept under the control of a socialist governing class of social engineers.
You know what the theme I'm getting from what you're saying?
Yeah,
it's like there's a club, and you and I are not part of it.
Yeah, Carlin was right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, these are all like the Fabian Society socialists. They're all misanthropic. They're all anti-humanists. So they just see socialism as sort of a useful tool to attract labor and poor people into their web, and they ultimately want to destroy labor and poor people. They're more fascist.
Right.
They see it as a stepping stone towards fascism. In fact, my wife's new book that's going to be coming out next week is going to go into much more detail on that point. You might even want to talk to her about that.
Yeah.
So that was basically volume 2, was taking off from that story and tracing out the battles throughout the 20th century. Volume 3 was more on the question now of what is Russia and China today and historically, to give people a sense more of like now how are certain processes expressing themselves from the standpoint of the anti-Malthusian struggle.
Yeah.
Those who don't wish to have a depopulation-based world order, which is Russia, China, India. Currently, where did that come from? That's more volume 3. And then volume 4 is going to be on the real origins and controllers of the deep state more generally. What was the British Empire, which is not what people thought it was. What is it back, in the 17th century, 18th century, but also today, as an active agency currently now in the world now. It's not like a thing of the past. So that'll be volume 4 in January.
So it's really interesting because when you start digging, you start finding that things are not what they seem. Like Mao, he was like, his schooling was paid by, was it the Carnegie Foundation or was it the Rockefellers? But it's all these people are tied together, and that is so perfect to lead in to Smedley Butler. Because here's a man who was a patriot, was a human being, and knew his soul was worth more than what was being offered to him in the material world, because he was offered everything. And the beautiful thing, when I think of him, I think of John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace while he was, for those of you who don't know the story, he was part of the slave trade, and he's going across the Atlantic with slaves, and he has a moment of clarity. And for the rest of his life, not immediately, many of the abolitionists in England attended his church. So he was part of something bad, but he was wise enough to have that moment and to actually spend the rest of his life doing something good for humanity, leaving a legacy. And when I think of Smedley Butler, I think of John Newton.
Yeah, that's apropos. That does bring the question back to how we began our conversation regarding the matter of the Society of the Cincinnatus from the United States founding, and the principle of Cincinnatus as far as what he represented as the citizen soldier principle, a man who was animated by patriotism and love of country, love of his morality, the health of his soul, and was able to put his knowledge of war to use, and his insight as a strategist to use, becoming the most dominant position, like as you said, the tyrant of Rome. But he didn't have a motive for power, or he didn't lust for material gains, because he was more than happy, once he did his job of defending Rome, to go back to the farm. And that's something that George Washington, certainly, he always yearned to return to the farm, despite the fact that he was the first president. And that ethos is very strong, especially in the US, which cultivated this idea that the soldier is somebody who should equally be able to turn his sword into a plow, and you should have this idea that every citizen is not in war for the sake of being part of a military industrial complex or some Spartan careerist soldier class. That should not be it, although that's what was done increasingly to transform the American military after World War II into a Pax Americana agency, which is what people like Samuel P. Huntington had drafted as a program called the Soldier and the State. His theory that you should have a permanent soldier mercenary class modeled on the Spartan ideal, which is very different from the Athenian citizen soldier and the Roman citizen soldier that we're talking about.
So Matt, who is Smedley Butler?
Smedley Butler was a general he was a Marine, and he was somebody who was assigned to play or expected to play a certain role at a moment in history when the US was slipping into a fascist hell. The Great Depression had already been sprung onto the US people in 1929. It was a coordinated controlled demolition. And those who sprung that controlled demolition, and I'm talking now about the J.P. Morgan, Warburg, DuPont complex, were also in the midst of pouring millions and millions of dollars into the growth of fascism across Europe as the miracle economic solution to the crisis of the Depression. And we're also, through things like the Massey Foundation or Macy Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and others, pouring money also into the science of eugenics as the new science of racial purification and weeding out the human gene pool of the unfit. So the US was on the verge now in 1931-32 of embracing that trap that had been accepted by the people of Austria, by the people of Germany, increasingly of France. Marshal Pétain was taking control even in Britain. You had the rise of people like Sir Oswald Mosley. And in the United States, fascism was really taking hold. So a big part of that was the American Legion was run by, at that time, leading fascists like Alvin Ousley, who was an openly pro-fascist figure who was the head of the American Legion, who wanted the US to model their regime on Mussolini. And J.P. Morgan and those others were happy to try to put all of the resources into such a solution. The problem was Franklin Roosevelt had just been elected, and he was one of the few anti-fascist candidates who was rejecting this idea and instead trying to renew what Abraham Lincoln and McKinley were doing earlier, as far as restoring a constitutional method of banking, both internally but also externally too. And that he had to be undone. So the objective or the plan that was cooked up by the JP Morgan crowd was to harness the power and energy of the striking World War I veterans who had not received their bonus pays that were promised of them, largely because there was a Great Depression and there wasn't the money to pay them their bonus pays. So there was over 500,000 striking Army veterans across the United States. Many of them had found themselves in Washington, D.C., camping out for several years. It was quite a desperate situation, as people know. But how to harness that? They required a leader. General Butler was somebody, he was the highest decorated soldier in U.S. history, which he maintains to this very day in the Guinness Book of World Records. He was respected and admired by the veterans because he was outspoken against the corruption of the USA. He himself had a long career, which he goes through in his War's a Racket book published in 1935, serving as an agency for J.P. Morgan, Standard Oil, and others, overthrowing governments that were not favorable to the U.S. business class and banking class, from Nicaragua, Cuba, China, a variety of places, doing interventions, sometimes running even assassinations, though he didn't talk about that part of it. But he described at a certain point how he was sick and tired of being this. This is not what he signed up for. And he thought it was originally, my duty not to ask questions. That's part of the problem, is many soldiers are trained to be obedient. And he did that for too long. He got sick of that. And so he started speaking out openly, starting in the 1920s, against this corruption. And so that's why he won the favor and the support of many of the people. And those around J.P. Morgan, people like Thomas Lamont, leading kingmaker within the Democratic Party and an enemy of Franklin Roosevelt, saw him as the perfect guy to be used as the fascist battering ram to oust President Roosevelt, to take 500,000 of these striking veterans and storm the White House like stormtroopers and install now this Wall Street run government under his nominal control. So he played along with this for a certain period. And I didn't say this, but he was a Quaker, and he was somebody who had a devout faith in God that I think played a role in his ability to stand up to this very evil agency. And when the opportunity came, he basically played along, acting like he was interested in being part of the conspiracy, got more and more of the names of those who were involved higher up, which involved some very, very big people like Robert Sterling Clark, the head of the Singer Sewing Machine dynasty, Grayston Provost Murphy, a JP Morgan bond salesman and director, many, many figures. And this brought us into the Brown Brothers Harriman Network, which is what Prescott Bush was also a part of. That was also funding Hitler too, keep that in mind.
Wait a sec, Prescott Bush was part of this,
Yeah.
and he was also funded Hitler. And
Hmm.
instead of being hung, he got 2 presidents.
Yeah, he was basically he was found guilty in a Trading with the Enemies Act investigation in Congress in 1941 after the U.S. had entered the war, because he was still with at that time with Union Banking Corporation, doing a lot of business with the Nazi machine, and he was found out. They confiscated Union Bank's holdings. And after the war, not only did he not face any repercussions, but he was basically made a dominant senator. And like you said, he almost had 3. Jeb almost got in as president had Trump not kicked his ass in public.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's this whole nasty web. And so Butler went first to J. Edgar Hoover, at the time the head of the FBI still. I mean, he didn't know what Hoover was, but Hoover said basically, it's not my business. No statutes have been broken. Go away. So then he changed gears, went to the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, which was at the time 2 senator and a congressman who were overseeing the House on Un-American Activities Committee, which was mostly at that time, that was pre-Cold War. So its job was mostly to try to find Japanese fascist and Nazi fifth columnists in America. And there were many. And they did a 1-month-long investigation into Butler's claims and found them all to be correct. And they substantiated everything. They published a massive report. Unfortunately, it was classified and sanitized. There was a sanitized draft for the public consumption, which didn't say any names. The actual full document was only declassified after, I think, 2007, where now you could finally read it and get all the dope. But his work was instrumental. By blowing the whistle, he gave Franklin Roosevelt the leverage that FDR needed to put a leash onto these traitors in the heart of America, and force them, in a certain measure, to behave according to the national will and the will of Roosevelt, who wanted instead a New Deal, a real recovery premised around the building of real large-scale infrastructure investments, which they finally had to play a hand in positively. Keep in mind, they were also the same individuals, and Roosevelt knew this, who were behind the assassination attempt earlier in February 1933, when an Italian Freemason was deployed, an anarchist, again, like in the case of McKinley, to kill Roosevelt. A woman in the audience was a bit too fast and hit his hand. He ended up killing the mayor of Chicago, Cermak, instead, who was standing right next to FDR. So FDR knew that he was at war with this very dangerous thing. And so Butler played, again, a key role. And anyone who wants to can go online, and you might even want to splice this into our conversation, go on YouTube, and you can actually type in Smedley Butler coup plot and listen to his own broadcast that he recorded in December 1935 at Universal Studios, which was broadcast to millions of Americans, going through exactly what had happened, what was this fascist coup agenda. So that was the whole thing, and today, the reason why this was a big part of my book, Volume 2, and it's going to be a big part of my book, Volume 4 again. Today, the reason why I've put this article on the front burner again, because it was originally something I had written many years ago and I updated it, is because Joe Biden had passed a certain bill, the Defense Authorization Act of 2022, called HR 4350, which gives the executive full authorization to control the budget and deployment of the U.S. military internally inside of the borders of the U.S. itself, bypassing any congressional oversight, which, as we all know, looking at the new effort to try to declare war on domestic terrorists, basically anybody who's not playing along with this Great Reset agenda are basically now being labeled, enemies of the state, and thus susceptible to receiving the sort of treatment that people have suffered now who were just simply there on January 6th and have been in solitary confinement, right? There's a giant war on, or in the case of Canadians, there's been an effort to try to paint everybody who went to the Freedom Convoy, very peaceful protest, as if there were all these domestic terrorists. So that's the new sort of agenda. And Biden himself is a very weak, kind of like an older version of Justin Trudeau. There's nothing behind the eyeballs, but a very corrupt figure nonetheless. And it would be very easy to fathom having him removed or having some excuse to have him not be there, and having this power that is completely unconstitutional used in order to bring about and weaponize the military against the people, which is what it would have been back in 1932, 33. So, and what we've seen in Germany in the case of Italy and other places that did go full fascist. So that was it. And I just want people really to think about Butler, because I didn't know about him up until somewhat recently. It was a big shock for me. It changes everything about how you think about that period of history. And it also gets you to change your mind about how you think about what's causing the present situation that we're currently living through too, which desperately needs more Smedley Butlers.
One of the things that actually got my attention is that these large corporations, these people running corporations, were planning to get rid of the republic, get rid of democracy. And these were not elected people. They thought they knew best for the average man, woman, and child for America. And what they were planning to do was evil. Eugenics is evil. There's no other word for it. Thinking that, I say that you're not worth living. Who has that right? Like, we've all been given a gift, and I like to believe we all been given a soul, a spirit, and no other human being has the right to make that decision. Now, I finished reading, very quick read, War's a Racket by Major General Smedley Butler. He produced it very quickly. He wanted to get it out to the public. It was a bestseller in 1935. It's worth listening to. It's worth reading.
Yeah.
And what he says is the people who should decide whether we go to war are not old men or old women in the case of Nancy Pelosi. It should be the people who are going to go and sacrifice. And he said that once that happens, then there'll be no war. And he pointed out something else at the very beginning of his book. It's all about money and power and control, because you have so much money, it's no longer about money. Bill Gates doesn't care about money.
Yeah.
He could have gold and toilet paper for the rest of his life. It's not about money anymore. It's about power. And Butler points out that during World War I, reported on tax returns in the United States, there were 21 millionaires and there were billionaires produced during World War I. He said these people get rich off of people suffering.
Yeah. Ferdinand Pecora had said from the Pecora Commission, who did the criminal investigations into J.P. Morgan and the Wall Street groupings, had said, if you steal $25, you're a thief. If you steal 25 million, you're a financier.
Yes. And the reason I'm so glad that you spoke with me, Matt, and I want to thank you, is Butler was in the Marines. He was in the military. Well, we really don't have much of a military. It's volunteer. But we have people who benefited from a free society. And it's important for these individuals who prospered during the old system, because we're definitely not going back to the old system. Klaus Schwab said we're going to be grumpy and we're not going back. To put down the plow and now to get active in their government, making sure that they're watching these individuals who are writing policies, suing, being very, being good citizens and using examples from people in the past that he had nothing to win by standing up other than something that is priceless, his soul and his dignity. Mm-hmm. And that's worth more than things, because things leave us. But who we are and what we do and questioning what's important, that's eternal.
Yep. Amen, brother. Amen.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government. I talked with an investigator for this committee who came to me with a subpoena on Sunday, November 18th. He told me they had unearthed evidence linking my name with several such veteran organizations. As it then seemed to me to be getting serious, I felt it was my duty to tell all I knew of such activities to this committee. My main interest in all this is to preserve our democratic institutions. I want to retain the right to vote, the right to speak freely, and the right to write. If we maintain these basic principles, our democracy is safe. No dictatorship can exist with suffrage, freedom of speech, and press.
And the greatest healer for anybody later on in life is to mentor younger people. And I find this all the time. I sit down with business owners all the time, and they always give me unsolicited advice because they want to share their knowledge, and it's really important.
Here with me is Peter Merrick,
president of MerrickWealth.com.
Peter is an income and capital enhancement consultant,
speaker, and author.
He is also a recognized expert in the world of succession planning.
There's over 800 published articles and 3 industry textbooks.
He's a Canadian who joins us today from San Diego, California. Thanks for joining us.
So, Peter Merrick, tell us about you.
Well, I've been in the financial service industry since the end of 1991.
I graduated during the recession. The baby boomers were in their positions, so there was no jobs. So the two businesses that opened up were the technology field and the financial field. It was the Wild West in both of them. So I had this brilliant idea, and I had a friend of mine, and we started talking, and I said, hey, how difficult would it be for us to get a mutual fund dealer license? Not difficult enough. Thank God for those 10 years, the market just went up. I would sit down and I would take somebody's entire life savings that they spent 15, 20 years accumulating it, this young kid who knew nothing about nothing, and I would go and just invest it, and luckily it went up because the markets were crazy in the 90s. It was a boom time. But in 2004, my life blew up.
I almost went bankrupt, but I was very fortunate because there were very few CFPs at the time, but every university in Canada wanted to offer the CFP program, so I got recruited as a prof. And it was great. I was reading all the textbooks. I would call all the big publishers. And what I came to the conclusion was the succession planning was missing.
One of the issues is there was very little talking beyond the accumulation stage. Like, how do you have a healthy life after you've done that?
I also looked at demographics. At the turn of the 20th century, the average life expectancy in the West and North America was 43 years old. And people are dying at 83. No one ever lived to 83.
Well, so I always say that there's two financial plans. There's the financial one that we work on, and there's what you get to do with all your time and that energy once you're done. And with this thing that they've been racing towards, they've hit it. But if they haven't thought about what they're going to do after or how they're going to feel validation for their existence, they just never stop. They just keep going.
Well, it's not anybody's fault because when people are young, they focus too much on doing, and later on in life, they have to focus on being.
So I wrote my own textbooks because
I thought it was very important to talk about how do you transition from the first half of life, which Carl Jung called it the mourning, where you're accumulating, whether it's your ego, designations, education, houses.
The second half is deconstruction, giving wisdom away, giving away my money, giving away my time, leaving a legacy.
So talk to me about that stage. What's the purposeful way or kind of the best practices, ways, or considerations for people to take when transitioning into that stage of life?
Well, one, decide whether or not you want an exit. I find between the ages of 55 in 70. A lot of people feel that I'm just tired doing the same thing that I've always done, and I have the money now. So maybe I should get out when the going is good and pass on my business to someone who's got the energy to navigate it. Number two, who are you going to sell your business to? There's one issue about selling it to a family member or an employee. What happens after you sell it? Things don't go right. A lot of business owners want to sell their business because they just want to wash their hands. But by selling it to someone you know, you're not getting out of your business. The best is to sell to a third-party purchaser. The last one is after they make that transition from being a business owner, building a nest egg for themselves to have choice, they don't know what they're going to do. I've spoken to people who say, you know, I'm going to take up golf. So my question is, do you golf now? I don't golf now. So what makes you think you're going to golf later? I just want to share with you guys a story. There was a gentleman, his name was Bob Hunter. He was quite a celebrity. He started Greenpeace during the height of my blow up. When I was going through business loss, he was bringing me on national television. And you know what he was doing? He was saying, so Peter, don't you do that? And then he would give my phone number and he would give my web address. The reason why it went by merrickwealth.com, because it was almost like a phone number that would run across the television and I could actually see myself making money off of it. And he was dying. He had prostate cancer. And he turned to me and said, Peter, one day you will be in a position that you'll help someone else. And let me share with you about the legacy. Bob's been dead for 16 years. And I'm sharing you the legacy of Bob Hunter because he made a difference for me. And if I make a difference in anyone else's life, I'm a product of those people who are willing to do things and they had no expectations. And a true mentor is someone who has no expectations that they're going to see the tree blossom.
The reason I wrote The King of Main Street is younger people don't know how to find the right mentors, and older people have this need to mentor. It's almost like a biological need because they can see beyond their physical existence. They know that the sun was here before them and it will be after them, and what's going to be left behind that they leave.
I would joke, I can't make you money, but I can definitely save you money. What I mean by that is I am a Sherpa. That's someone who would guide someone to help them come down. But I realize the most precious asset they have is not their money. It's their time.
What last piece of advice would you like to give our listeners?
If you have a business, the most important thing to ask yourself is, why did you get into the business? And it's usually not to create a legacy, it's to create the lifestyle that you want. And at that point, ask yourself, what do you want to do during your last days? The last human freedom is to choose one's own beliefs, one's own way. Everything else you can have taken away from you. But what you believe and how you choose to act in the world, that is yours. And the greatest healer for anybody later on in life is to mentor younger people. And that is going to give you fulfillment emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. You guys have been wonderful, and I want to thank you, and I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you.